You know, when we talk about South Africa's transition in 1994, the word miracle gets used a lot. But what if the story we all know isn't the full story? What if it's not even half of it? We're about to dive into a forensic audit report that presents a radically different narrative. It makes an explosive claim that the celebrated handover wasn't a real transfer of power at all, but a meticulously designed capture of the state's economic levers.
So, right off the bat, here is the central claim from the report, and it is a bombshell. Basically, the audit is saying that what looked like this huge political victory on the world stage was, behind the scenes, an economic sleight of hand. The argument is that the whole system was set up to transfer assets, not real, meaningful power. This single sentence really forces us to re-examine everything we thought we knew about that historic moment.
Okay, so you're probably asking, how could something like that even happen? Well, the report points to one core mechanism, and it calls it administrative decoupling. Think of it this way. The old regime knew it couldn't hang on to political power through force anymore, right? The writing was on the wall. So, according to this audit, they made a strategic trade. They decoupled the visible political part of control from the invisible financial control. They basically gave up one to keep the other.
And the report has this really powerful metaphor to make this clear. It says that while the entire world was watching the visible throne, the new president, the parliament, the new flag, all the symbols of change, the real power was quietly being rerouted to something it calls the invisible ledger. And that ledger, that's the world of corporate ownership, of national debt, of financial law. That's the stuff that doesn't make the headlines, but it's where the old economic structure could be kept perfectly intact.
All right, so where's the proof? Where does the report say we should look for evidence of this? Well, it points us to a very specific moment in time, the 1993 Compromise. The argument here is that if you really want to understand this architecture of capture, you have to zoom in on the negotiations that created the new South Africa. Because this wasn't just about politics. According to the audit, it was fundamentally a financial deal. And here's the crucial detail the report hammers home. These historic negotiations, they didn't just happen in some ideal, abstract setting. No, they took place under extreme financial duress, and that pressure, it claims, is what forced a compromise. A compromise that, above all else, protected the existing economic status quo and set the stage for everything that came after. So, what was the actual legal tool used to lock this in? The report points a finger directly at the Property Clause, Section 25, in the new Constitution. It calls it the constitutional seal. See, by putting in that requirement for just and equitable compensation for land, it basically cemented all the colonial and apartheid-era ownership right into the DNA of the new country. The result? The new government, which was already broke, had absolutely no way to afford any kind of significant redistribution. It couldn't afford to buy back the country. Okay, so the legal framework is set, but the audit says that wasn't enough. It argues that on top of the Constitution, two massive financial traps were laid right from the start, just to make sure the new state could never escape its economic past. The first of these traps has to do with a concept called odious debt. Now, this isn't some fringe idea. It's a real principle in international law. It basically says that if a new democratic government comes to power, it doesn't have to pay back the debts that the old despotic regime took on to oppress its own people. And the report is very clear on this. That was a very real option for South Africa in 1994. But that's not what happened. Instead, the new government agreed to take on all of the apartheid regime's debt. And according to this audit, the consequences were immediate and, frankly, devastating. All this money that should have been going to build new houses, new schools, new infrastructure, it was immediately diverted to pay off these old loans. It basically created a debt-slave state from day one. All right, on to the second trap the audit identifies. This one was all about stripping the new government of what's called monetary sovereignty. And how was this done? By making sure the South African Reserve Bank, the country's central bank, stayed independent and, crucially, partly privately owned. Now, on the surface, that might sound like standard modern economic policy, but this report frames it as an absolutely critical piece of the capture architecture. And again, the audit uses a really sharp analogy to explain this point. It says the new government got the steering wheel of the country. They could pass laws, they could run departments, they could steer. But the engine, the power to actually create money, to set interest rates, to control the fuel of the economy, that was kept separate, controlled by the private financial system. So, if this system was captured way back in 1994, how did it stay that way for decades? How is it maintained? Well, an addendum to the report offers an explanation. It introduces one final piece of this whole structure:
something it calls the buffer class mechanism.
Okay, and this is where we get into one of the most controversial claims in the entire report. It argues that Black economic empowerment, BEE, wasn't actually designed for broad, mass upliftment. Instead, its purpose was to create a small, elite buffer class and integrate them into the existing corporate structure, to bring them inside the tent, so to speak.
So how does that work in the real world? The report gives an example it calls the markup leak. Here's the setup. The state needs to procure something, goods, services, whatever. Often, it has to go through a BEE intermediary. That intermediary adds a big markup, often without adding any real value, which inflates the price the public ends up paying. And this, the report says, creates a constant leak, just draining money from the budget. And the end result of all this is what the report calls a silence dividend. I mean, what a phrase. The new elite, who now have a stake in the system, who are profiting from these deals, they now have a very powerful financial reason not to challenge the foundations of the system, not to ask hard questions about that odious debt or about the Reserve Bank's policies. In the audit's view, they are essentially being paid to stay quiet and keep the door to real fundamental change firmly locked. So let's pull this all together. We've got the legal framework, the two big financial traps, and this buffer class mechanism. What's the final verdict from this forensic audit? Well, it's pretty blunt. It concludes that the 1994 transition wasn't really a change in ownership of the country's economy. It was just a change in management. So to recap the report's main points, the entire system that was built after 1994 rests on these three pillars of capture. First, there's the inherited debt, making the new state pay for its own oppression. Second, there's economic immunity, using the Constitution itself to shield old wealth. And third, monetary capture, taking control over the money supply away from the people who were actually elected.
And the report leaves us with this one final, haunting metaphor. It says the political framework that everyone celebrated isn't a vehicle for change at all. It is the cage. And that leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? If the very foundation of the nation was designed, as this audit claims, to be the cage, then how can you ever build real change on top of it?